In a town long forgotten by the world, where boarded-up shops and empty streets told stories of broken promises, one woman carried the weight of her people's future. She had walked away from wealth, prestige, and a corner office high above the city skyline, only to return home to a community on the verge of collapse. Greedy developers circled like vultures, eager to erase generations of black-owned businesses with the stroke of a pen. But just when it seemed nothing could stop the demolition, one determined lawyer stepped into the fight. What no one knew was that her case would not only expose corruption at the highest level, but ignite a battle that would change her town forever. The city skyline had always been her kingdom. Tall glass towers reflected ambition, and the endless hum of traffic was the background music to her success. Amara Johnson, a sharp, fearless black lawyer, had carved out a career many only dreamed of. She was the first in her family to attend law school, the first to step into a prestigious firm, and the first to hold her head high in rooms where very few who looked like her were welcomed. She thrived under pressure, conquered case after case, and built a reputation as a woman no one could outwit in the courtroom. But none of her accolades, awards or tailored suits could silence the quiet ache in her chest. Each time she passed the glimmering restaurants and boutiques near her office, she thought of her hometown, Brooksville, a small, struggling community tucked between highways and farmland, where her grandmother still ran a fading diner that had once been the heart of the neighborhood. Brooksville had been more than a place. It was history, resilience, a symbol of what black families had built when the world gave them nothing. Generations had poured sweat into businesses that became anchors, barbershops, corner stores, cafes, laundromats. But by the time Amara left for college, the cracks had begun to show. Factories closed, young people moved away, and developers, slick men in suits with clipboards and promises, started circling, offering pennies for property that had been passed down for decades. Amara told herself she had left all that behind. She had earned her escape, but the truth was, she never really escaped it. Every Sunday call from her grandmother, every headline about Brooksville's decline, every memory of block parties and church gatherings haunted her. And then, one morning, her phone buzzed with the call she had always dreaded. Her grandmother's voice trembled. "They're taking the diner, baby. They said the papers are signed, but I never signed nothing." That was the moment Amara's world shifted. She walked into her sleek office that day with her resignation letter in hand. Colleagues stared in disbelief. Partners begged her to reconsider. "You're on track to make senior partner before you're 40, they said. "Don't throw it all away for a lost cause." But Amara's mind was made up. Her success meant nothing if she couldn't use it to protect the very people who had raised her. When she returned to Brooksville, the change was jarring. The town square, once bustling with children riding bikes and families laughing on sidewalks, looked hollow. Windows were boarded. Businesses stood empty, their signs fading into ghosts of what they once were. Yet despite the despair, Amara saw traces of resilience everywhere. An old man sweeping the stoop of his closed store, teenagers gathering on street corners, women sitting outside beauty salons swapping stories even when customers were scarce. The news of her return spread quickly. Some welcomed her with open arms. Others, hardened by years of disappointment, doubted her. "She's too city now," they whispered. "She won't understand what we've been through. She thinks she can outsmart the developers? They've got money, power, lawyers. What's she got?" Amara heard the doubt, but she didn't let it break her. She knew skepticism was natural. People had been let down too many times before. What mattered was proving, through action, that she was here to stay, and she wasn't afraid to fight. Her grandmother's diner became her headquarters. The faded red booths, cracked linoleum floors, and scent of frying oil and cornbread became the backdrop for whispered meetings. Business owners shuffled in with paperwork, shady contracts, threatening letters, eviction notices. Developers had used every dirty trick in the book, forged signatures, confusing legal jargon, intimidation. They were counting on people being too poor, too scared, or too uneducated to fight back. But they hadn't counted on Amara. She set up stacks of files, spread out blueprints, and studied the contracts word for word. Patterns began to emerge. Mistakes, fraud, loopholes. These developers weren't invincible, they were sloppy, and that sloppiness was her weapon. Still, the weight of the task pressed heavily on her. She was just one woman, with no firm behind her, no team of paralegals. And the opposition was vast, with deep pockets and influence in the county courthouse. Winning this fight meant more than just saving her grandmother's diner. It meant stopping the destruction of Brooksville's very identity. One evening, after a long day of sifting through documents, Amara walked home past the old church. Its doors were locked, the once thriving congregation now scattered. Yet carved into the cornerstone were words that felt like they were meant for her. Built by hands that refused to give up. It reminded her why she came back. She wasn't here just for her grandmother. She was here for every family who had poured their souls into building something out of nothing. She was here for the little boy who should grow up seeing pride in his community, not bulldozers tearing it down. The fight would be ugly. The developers would retaliate. The town's doubts might deepen before hope resurfaced. But Amara was ready. She had walked away from luxury and power not to surrender, but to fight harder than she ever had. And as she closed the diner that night, the air heavy with anticipation, one truth became clear. Brooksville was not dead. Not yet. Because she had come home to defend it. Amara's first weeks back in Brooksville felt like stepping into a storm. Every morning she woke before sunrise, poured herself coffee at the diner, and spread out stacks of files across the counter. Her grandmother watched silently, her eyes full of pride but also worry. "Baby, you can't take the whole world on your shoulders," she'd whisper. Amara would smile faintly, knowing the truth. If she didn't take this on, no one else could. The developers wasted no time in making their presence known. Their signs sprouted across town like weeds, billboards promising a brighter future for Brooksville, glossy flyers depicting lakeside condos, luxury shopping malls, and resorts. On the surface, it looked like progress, but to Amara it was a lie. The people in those images looked nothing like the residents of Brooksville. Their future erased everyone who already called the town home. At community meetings in the diner, Amara listened to stories that made her blood boil. Mr. Peterson, who ran the barbershop for 50 years, showed her a contract with his signature forged at the bottom. Mrs. Alvarez, who owned the laundromat, described men in suits showing up late at night, insisting she sell before it was too late. A young father admitted he was threatened. If he didn't agree to sell his store, inspectors would suddenly discover violations and shut him down. Amara documented everything. She kept files labeled with names, dates, and contracts, building a fortress of evidence. But gathering proof wasn't enough. She needed allies. So she knocked on doors, visited churches, and spoke at schools, urging people not to give in to fear. "Brooksville is worth fighting for," she'd tell them. "If they succeed, we lose not just our businesses, but our history, our dignity, everything our parents and grandparents built." Some believed her, others were hesitant. "You're just one lawyer," they'd say. "What can you really do against billion-dollar corporations?" That doubt didn't surprise her, but it fueled her fire. Her first move was filing an injunction in court to stop the developers from moving forward. Walking into the courthouse, she felt the weight of every eye on her. The developers' lawyers, polished and smug, smirked at her like she was nothing more than an annoyance. "Miss Johnson," one said condescendingly, "this is far too big for a small-town girl. Why don't you leave it to the professionals?" Amara stared him down, her voice calm but sharp. "Funny, you must not be used to professionals who don't fold when the stakes are high." The hearing was grueling. The opposing side had an army of attorneys, each armed with binders, charts, and rehearsed arguments. But Amara was sharper. She pointed out inconsistencies, highlighted fraudulent signatures, and questioned the legality of their intimidation tactics. By the end, the judge reluctantly issued a temporary halt on all development until further investigation. It wasn't a victory, it was a pause, but it gave Brooksville hope. Hope, however, came with consequences. Days later, Amara returned to the diner to find the front window shattered. Spray painted across the wall were the words, "You can't stop us!" Her grandmother trembled as she swept up the glass, but Amara only clenched her fists tighter. Fear was exactly what they wanted, and she refused to give it to them. The intimidation escalated. Anonymous phone calls in the middle of the night. Cars idling outside her house with headlights on. Rumors spread in town that she was only here for attention or angling for money. The developers knew they couldn't beat her in court without a fight, so they tried to turn her community against her. But instead of breaking her, it made her more determined. Amara doubled her efforts. She worked with investigative journalists to expose the corruption. She partnered with activists who had fought similar battles in other cities. She spent late nights drafting petitions and early mornings training residents on how to legally resist eviction. Slowly, the tide began to shift. The people of Brooksville, once resigned to their fate, started standing taller. Business owners refused new offers. Families linked arms outside their homes when inspectors tried to force entry. The barber, the laundromat owner, the grocer, all began speaking out, emboldened by Amara's leadership. Still, the developers fought back harder. They accused her of stirring unrest. They filed motions to discredit her, attacking her reputation. At one point, they even offered her a bribe, millions of dollars to walk away quietly. Amara looked them in the eye and said, "You couldn't pay me enough to sell out my people." The fight became bigger than contracts. It became a movement. News outlets began covering the story. Lawyer fights to save historic Blacktown from developers. Social media spread videos of Amara speaking passionately at rallies. Donations poured in from strangers who believed in the cause, but with visibility came greater risk. One evening, as she walked home from the courthouse, Amara noticed footsteps behind her. The hairs on her neck stood up. She turned down a side street, quickening her pace, but the footsteps grew louder. Suddenly, a hand grabbed her arm. She spun around, ready to fight, only to see one of the developer's junior lawyers. His face was pale. "Miss Johnson," he whispered urgently, "you don't know what you're up against. They'll ruin you. They'll ruin this town. They've done it before." Amara's heart pounded, but she steadied her voice. "Then help me stop them." The man hesitated, fear flickering in his eyes. Then, almost imperceptibly, he slipped her a folder before disappearing into the night. Inside the folder were documents the developers never intended anyone to see. Internal emails, bank transfers, proof of backroom deals with city officials. It was the smoking gun she had been waiting for. The stakes were higher than ever now. With these documents, Amara could bring the entire scheme crashing down, but only if she survived long enough to present them in court. The next phase of the battle was clear. The developers weren't just playing dirty, they were desperate. And desperate enemies were the most dangerous of all. The day of the final hearing arrived like a storm over Brooksville. The courthouse was packed. Business owners, families, church elders, and even journalists who had traveled from neighboring states filled every bench. For the people of Brooksville, this wasn't just a legal proceeding. It was the moment their survival hinged upon. Amara stood tall at the plaintiff's table, her grandmother watching from the first row, her hands clasped in prayer. Across the room sat the developers, flanked by their army of attorneys, polished in suits, smug in their confidence. They believed money always won. They believed intimidation always silenced opposition. But Amara wasn't there to be silenced. The opposing side presented first. Their lead attorney, a silver-haired man known for crushing community resistance cases, spoke with arrogance dripping from every word. He painted Brooksville as a dying town, claiming redevelopment was the only hope. He framed business owners as irresponsible for refusing to sell. His words twisted history, erasing decades of sacrifice and resilience. The developers nodded approvingly, as if the case was already in the bag. When it was Amara's turn, she rose slowly, her heart pounding but her voice steady. She began not with legal jargon but with humanity. "Brooksville," she said, letting the name linger in the air, "is not just land. It is legacy. It is sacrifice. It is survival." She spoke of the barber who cut hair for generations, of the laundromat that served families through hard times, of the grocery store that gave credit to neighbors when money was tight. She painted a picture of a town built brick by people who had nothing handed to them, yet created everything with dignity. Then her tone sharpened. The developers want you to believe this community is worthless. But it is their tactics, fraud, intimidation, corruption, that are truly without value. Gasps rippled through the courtroom as Amara pulled out the folder, the secret documents handed to her by the nervous junior lawyer. She laid them on the judge's bench. These are internal communications, she declared. Emails that prove collusion between developers and officials. Proof of bribes, proof of forged signatures, proof that this entire scheme was built not on progress, but on lies. The developers' attorneys scrambled, objecting furiously, but the judge overruled them. The documents were admitted into evidence. Amara flipped through page after page. Reading excerpts aloud. Push them harder, they'll cave. We'll take care of the inspectors. Just get the signatures. If Johnson doesn't back off, we'll make sure her license is questioned. Each word was like a dagger in the developer's case. The crowd murmured, outrage building with every revelation. The defense tried to recover, claiming the documents were taken illegally, but Amara struck back hard. These are the words of men who thought no one was watching. But the people of Brooksville are watching. The world is watching. She turned toward the packed gallery, her voice rising. They want to erase our history. They want to bulldoze our homes, our shops, our churches. But we are not disposable. We are not invisible. And we will not be silenced. Her words thundered through the room, and for a moment, the courtroom felt less like a sterile chamber of law and more like a battlefield where truth itself was the weapon. The lead developer, seated at the defense table, could no longer hide his fury. His face turned red as he slammed his hand against the table. "This town is worth nothing," he shouted. "You're all standing in the way of progress." That outburst was his undoing. Gasps echoed, reporters' pens scratched furiously, and the judge's gavel slammed down for order. Amara seized the moment. Calm, clear, unshaken, she looked directly at him. Progress does not mean erasure. Progress does not mean destroying lives for profit. What you call worthless, we call home. The silence that followed was deafening. Even the judge leaned back, studying the developers with cold disapproval. Hours later, when the gavel finally fell, the ruling was clear. The injunction became permanent. The contracts tied to fraud and corruption were voided. The developers were ordered to pay damages and face further investigation. Brooksville was safe. For a split second, Amara didn't breathe. The weight of months of battles, threats, and sleepless nights came crashing down all at once. And then applause erupted. The gallery stood to their feet, cheering, crying, hugging one another. Some shouted her name, others shouted, "Brooksville forever!" Her grandmother rushed forward, tears streaming down her face as she wrapped Amara in her arms. "You did it, baby," she whispered. "You saved us," but Amara knew it wasn't just her. It was every business owner who refused to sell. Every neighbor who stood guard. Every person who showed up to fight for what was theirs. The climax wasn't just her victory, it was Brooksville's victory. The dawn that broke over Brooksville the morning after the verdict seemed unlike any other. The usual stillness of the small town carried with it a hum of energy, like the very air was lighter, freer, almost celebratory. People walked down Main Street with something that had been missing for years. Hope. For so long, they had braced themselves against the inevitable, the fear of eviction notices, the anxiety of watching bulldozers roll in to destroy the only businesses that gave the town life. The developers had been a looming force, threatening to swallow up generations of hard work and history. But against all odds, the tide had turned, and at the center of it all was Jasmine Carter, a hero's quiet return. Jasmine didn't wake up to the cheer of crowds or the flashing lights of cameras. She woke up to silence, sitting in her late grandmother's modest house on the outskirts of town. The same home where she had grown up, the same home she had once sworn to leave behind forever. But as she stood at the kitchen sink sipping coffee, she could see the difference from the window. Neighbors waved to each other in the street. Store owners opened their shops with smiles that looked genuine, not forced. Children skipped to school without overhearing whispered conversations about their families possibly being forced to move. For the first time in years, Brooksville felt alive, and for the first time in a long while, Jasmine allowed herself to breathe. Gratitude from a community later that day. Jasmine visited the courthouse steps, the very place where she had stood weeks earlier, facing developers' lawyers armed with millions of dollars and arrogance to match. Now those same steps were filled with townspeople holding handmade signs. Thank you, Jasmine. Our town. Our future. Brooksville strong. Elderly shopkeepers approached her with tears streaming down their faces. One woman pressed a basket of fresh cornbread into her hands. A man hugged her so tightly she could feel the years of fear draining from him. Children ran up to her, tugging on her sleeve, calling her a hero. But Jasmine knew she wasn't just fighting for them. She had been fighting for herself too, for the little black girl who once felt invisible in this very town, who watched opportunities slip through her family's fingers because no one believed they belonged at the table. Now, she had carved out a new seat, not just for herself, but for everyone who had been overlooked. The developers' retreat. The developers who had tried to buy out Brooksville's land were nowhere to be seen. After losing the case, they quickly dissolved their local offices, pulling out of town as if Brooksville were cursed ground. Their glossy brochures promising luxury condos by the lake became nothing more than discarded paper. Some whispered they would try again, that developers always circled back eventually. But Jasmine had already helped the town put protections in place, legal safeguards, community trusts, and historic preservation statuses that made it nearly impossible for outsiders to exploit them again. The battle wasn't just won, it was secured. A shift in Jasmine's path for years. Jasmine had chased success in big cities, climbing the ranks of prestigious law firms where her face was often the only black one in the room. She had worn the sharp suits, argued cases that made headlines, and lived in a sleek high-rise that screamed achievement. But as she walked down Brooksville's familiar streets now, people greeting her like family, she realized something startling. None of that had ever filled her heart the way this did. She wasn't just a lawyer who had won a case. She was a daughter of Brooksville who had returned to heal what was broken, and maybe, just maybe, this was where she truly belonged. Seeds of renewal. Ripple effects of Jasmine's victory spread quickly. The local bakery, once weeks away from foreclosure, saw lines out the door every morning. A black-owned bookstore that had been struggling received new funding through a community co-op Jasmine helped establish. Farmers who had been afraid to plant for fear of losing their land now expanded their crops, confident that the soil beneath their feet was truly theirs. Even young people, many of whom had left Brooksville searching for better futures, began to talk about coming back. For the first time in decades, Brooksville felt like a place where dreams could grow instead of die. And Jasmine? She wasn't just practicing law anymore. She was building a legacy. The power of one choice. It would have been easier for Jasmine to stay in the city, to keep cashing her six-figure paychecks, to keep living in a world where her victories were recognized by headlines instead of neighbors. But deep down, she knew she would have always felt a void. Her decision to come back home had cost her plenty, comfort, certainty, even some relationships. Yet what she gained was immeasurable. The chance to protect her people, her history, and her roots. Her story wasn't just about law. It was about defiance. It was about proving that even the smallest towns, the most underestimated communities, could fight giants and win. And it was about showing that sometimes the greatest victories don't happen in skyscrapers, but in places like Brooksville, where the soil holds the memory of ancestors, and where justice means survival. A legacy for the future. Months later, Jasmine stood in front of a new building downtown, the Carter Legal Center for Justice. It wasn't flashy, just brick walls and glass doors, but it was powerful. The center offered free or affordable legal aid to small business owners, families, and especially black entrepreneurs who had been ignored by bigger firms. It was her way of making sure Brooksville never again found itself defenseless. A mural painted on the side of the building showed scenes of Brooksville's past. Farmers, shopkeepers, children playing in front of mom-and-pop stores. At the center of the mural, though, was Jasmine's grandmother, smiling proudly, her arms open as if she were embracing the whole town. Jasmine touched the mural and whispered, "We did it." The takeaway. The story of Jasmine Carter became more than a local victory. It became a symbol. A reminder that fighting for your roots, no matter how small or forgotten your community may seem, can change everything. She showed that courage isn't about never leaving home. It's about having the strength to return when it matters most. Brooksville wasn't just saved. It was reborn, and Jasmine wasn't just a lawyer anymore. She was living proof of what happens when one person dares to stand up against greed, protect their people, and choose legacy over luxury. The story ends not with Jasmine, but with the town she saved, still standing, still thriving, and now stronger than ever.